my first question for you, though, is what is your meditation practice like these days, right? In terms of, what's your ritual? Do you wake up first thing in the morning, meditate? Do you have tea first? Is it like an all day thing where you just kind of sit whenever you feel the need to? Like, what, you've been doing this for a very long time now, decades. What is it like today?
I have been doing it for a very long time. And first of all, thank you so much for having me on. It's wonderful to talk to you. I just celebrated a kind of awesome anniversary. I realized I've been practicing for 50 years. I first did a retreat in India, which is how I started. It's how I learned how to meditate. It began January 7th, 1971. So
Wow.
it was like, oh, wow. This it's outrageous to think about. It's just dreamlike. It's such a dream. So I still practice every day. It's interesting in sort of pandemic times where I'm not traveling at all, and I'm not like going out and seeing people at all, like, so many. I see my practice as really conforming to what is the classical description or delineation. There's like the formal period of practice where you may be sitting, or you may be walking, you may be lying down, whatever posture. But it's just like a period of dedication for these 10 minutes or 20 minutes or an hour. My goal is to deepen awareness and compassion, not to figure out my strategic plan or something like that. May come up, but that's not the intention. And then there's what we call short moments many times, which is just like sprinkling some mindfulness into your life. Probably the most famous comes from the Vietnamese Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh, who suggested, don't pick up your phone on the first ring. Let it ring 3 times and breathe. And then you pick it up. So that the sound of the phone ringing is the signal. Like, okay, come back to yourself. So I find in these times I'm doing both a lot more. I do try to sit in the morning. It's usually after caffeine of some kind, tea or coffee. But I like having that period. And I try to sit for, let's say, half an hour, maybe 40 minutes, but it could be 20 minutes also. And because of the current conditions of my life, I have so much more space and time to sort of do the other, and
right.
And to think, one thing I've noticed about myself in this time is that I've actually, I guess, made a resolve to be kinder, not even consciously, but I see that I'm rereading emails before pressing send. I'm just taking that time. And then I think, well, could this be misinterpreted? This is like a harsh form of communication, to begin with. And maybe I better take that sentence out, so I find I'm kind of practicing all through the day in different ways.
I love that. And I want to come back to that near the end of this interview. And I also want to come back to January 7th, 1971. But first, I want to take it all the way back to Washington Heights.
Oh, yeah.
When you think back to little Sharon, right? Youngest, your earliest memories, what was your favorite toy or activity?
Oh, well, I can't, of course, we're looking back over a lot of years. So, memory is somewhat dim. When I was a little bit older, not a tiny little tot, but it was always reading, it was
reading.
Always reading, because that was my experience of the world other than within the household. And so definitely a lot of that. I remember also raising little caterpillars in a box, but they didn't sadly last long.
Okay, I want to talk about that because you mentioned that in an interview before. You said your favorite animal was the caterpillar, but not the butterfly. What was that about? What was this fascination with caterpillars?
I don't remember exactly how it started, if it was like some relative or cousin or something like that, but I remember the box. I remember sort of the dirt, and the in effect the prayers that this little being would survive, which did not. But and you can get the symbolism of it. Well, it was all about change, it was all
Sure.
about there's another world.
But did you have that understanding or anything close to that understanding when you were a kid, or did you just think I just like the way they crawl, or they have so many, they're elegant in the way they move, or?
I don't think I had that conscious understanding,
Mhm.
not at all.
So when you weren't playing with caterpillars, you were reading books.
I was always reading books.
Were you an only child?
I was an only child from the time I was 9, I was growing up with my grandparents, with my father's parents. So, and before
Right.
then, there'd already been like tremendous disruption and loss in my household. So it was always, um, I was the only child, and it was always the kind of family dynamic where these things were never really ever openly talked about, And so I also had a strong internal world that I kept checking in with, but it wasn't getting any kind of confirmation from the external world. Like, yeah, the way you see things is true. That's really what happened. It was none of that. So there was kind of a big
Yeah, you
split there.
you had a tragedy with your mom. She was a big Nat King Cole fan. You've
She
mentioned
was.
before. Did she have a favorite Nat King Cole song?
That I don't remember, but she died when I was 9.
Hmm.
And my parents had gotten divorced when I was 4. So, and my father disappeared. So, for that time. And so I was living with my mother and her sister and brother, in that time in the Bronx. Before when she died, I moved to Washington Heights. So my memories are very kind of like an image, without a
Right.
lot of context. It's like, oh right, I remember that.
Can you talk a little bit about that night you guys were watching Nat King Cole and how that affected you?
I mean, when she died, or when she
Yeah.
got, yeah,
Yeah, when she died.
yeah. I mean, she actually didn't die that night, but my mother started hemorrhaging, and I was alone in the house with her, and uh, she told me what to do. I called an ambulance. I called my father's mother, uh, which my mother had told me to do, and said, you have to come get me, or someone has to come take care of me. And uh, now I don't know why, given the family dynamics, my mother told me to call her, but I did, and my mother was taken away in an ambulance, and given sort of cultural conditions at that time, I was not allowed to go see her in the hospital. And she died about 2 weeks later. And so I had never seen her again after that night when she went away by ambulance. And so then I was suddenly living with my father's parents. My father had been, totally out of my life since I was 4, and I barely knew them. So that was, if you count the divorce as the first major disruption, this was now the second, where I was living with these near strangers.
Did you have a spiritual or some sort of religious foundation where you could process these disruptions, or how was it explained to you?
Well, it was never explained to me. That was the point, like uh, my grandparents were immigrants from Poland, and I think they had a certain cultural value that they believed the kindest thing was just not to bring up my mother's name again, which they didn't, that it would upset me too much, it would hurt me too much. And uh, I, they were fairly observant Jews, and so I fell into the ritual of that. I wouldn't say I understood it, or why we couldn't turn on the lights on Saturday or something like that. But um, what I did have was a voice within.
Mm.
At some point, probably a little later than 9, which was very clear to me that there was another way of being, or there was another kind of life waiting for me, or there was
Mm,
something else, beyond these circumstances. And I also intuited that, studying and being really good at school was going to be a vehicle for that. And
mhm.
so in a way I was kind of biding my time.
Interesting. So, with the Dalai Lama, he's recognized as a child and kind of groomed to become this spiritual leader. I'm curious, and this is just a hypothetical question. Let's say three wise men came to you, back then when you were a teenager, after having dealt with all of that, and said, Sharon, one day you will be one of a handful of people to introduce this really powerful Eastern practice to mainstream America, and your work will affect millions of people and help them to find inner peace and happiness within. What would 14 or 15-year-old Sharon have thought about that prediction?
I would have thought it was ridiculous. And not only that, when it sounds like you've read my book Faith to know these details of my life. So uh, when my own teacher, this woman named Deepama, told me to teach, which was 1974, I'd been in India at that point for a number of years. I was coming back to the States for what I thought was a very brief visit back before I went back to India for the entire rest of my life. And I went to Calcutta to see her, just to say goodbye and get her blessing for my very, very brief journey back to the States. And she said, when you go back, you'll be teaching. And I said, no, I won't. And she said, yes, you will. I said, no, I won't. I mean, I thought it was ludicrous that I could do a thing like that. And she kept saying, yes, you will. And I kept saying, no, I won't. I'm coming right back. And then she said two things that were really remarkable, which really set the path for the rest of my life. One was, you really understand suffering. That's why you should teach.
Mm,
Which, looking back, was an extraordinary thing to say. I mean, first of all, she herself, as a human being, as a woman, had suffered tremendously in life: the loss of two of her children, loss of her husband, whom she loved very much. And it was through that pain, actually, that she sought meditation and found some way of kind of almost metabolizing the suffering into compassion. And she was an extraordinary person, an extraordinary teacher. So hearing that from her meant something. And I thought at one point, oh, it's funny. She didn't say like your realization is so awesome, or your scholarship is so erudite. It's like you really understand suffering. That's why you should teach, which is an interesting reflection on the challenges of our lives, and the strengths it may also give us. And then she said to me, way back in 1974, she said, you can do anything you want to do. It's your thinking you can't do it. That's
mm,
what's going to stop you. And I
mm.
left her room, which was like on the fourth floor of this building, and I went down these stairs thinking the whole time, no, I won't. I'm not going to do that. So, and I will say also, when I did start teaching, because of course she was right and I was wrong, with Joseph Goldstein and Jack Kornfield and other friends, I don't think one of us had the kind of vision that you just described. And none of us thought, let's start a movement. Let's really, it was like these methods, these techniques have helped each of us so much personally. And we have the blessing, we have the authorization, you could say, to pass it on from our own teachers, and the great encouragement of our own teachers to pass it on. Let's see if anyone here is interested. Let's try this one retreat. Let's do this. Let's do that. And it was always one step at a time. We made plenty of mistakes, but nowadays people often say, wow, you must have had such vision. And I think, well, not really, like.
Right. And I think that's one of the my objectives with telling these stories is showing people, when you look at the details of someone's trajectory, there were some embers in childhood, perhaps, right? But obviously you're too young to be able to understand it, what that is. And then, these little course correction things happen. And as you described them, they're family configurations that have been altered by death. And you had 5 of those, which then, catapulted you. You find yourself in college at 16 years old. Was it in Buffalo? You're in school?
I went to college. I went to high school in New York City, but I went to college in Buffalo.
College in Buffalo. And that's where you kind of happened to take this Asian philosophy class. Why did you take that class at that time?
Well, there were certain requirements. You needed a philosophy course, you needed a language course, you needed these different things over the course of the 4 years. And when I was a sophomore, I decided to fulfill the philosophy requirement. And I just looked at the schedule and I thought, oh, there's an Asian philosophy course. That's on Tuesday. That's convenient. Let me do that one. So, of course, it totally changed my life.
And how were you thinking about success at that time? Like, where did you see yourself at that time of your life, if you were going to project whatever, 10 or 20 years ahead?
I don't know if I thought that way, honestly, at the age of 16. I was, or 17 by the time I was a sophomore. I was in some way, the immediacy of life, like what am I going to major in, was very important. I was also reconciling my past in a way that I had never done before. So, like, of those 5 family configurations, by the time I was 16, going to college, some ended like, one change with my parents' divorce, one change with my mother's death. And then I lived with my grandparents, and then my grandfather died and my father came back. So I was 11 years old. I hadn't seen him since I was 4. And he was sort of a wreck at that point, from alcohol and mental illness, and very different from the reality of how he'd been before I was 4 and the image I'd held of him all this time. And he was only there for about 6 weeks in my grandma's house when he took an overdose of sleeping pills, and he was taken away by ambulance as well to a mental health facility, and he stayed in some kind of facility, VA hospital or nursing home or halfway house or something for the rest of his life, which was some decades. So my grandmother and other relatives said, well, he had an accident. He took a sleeping pill. He didn't remember he'd taken a sleeping pill.
Mm-hmm.
So he took another one and it was too much. So he had to go to the hospital. And it was only, so that was when I was 11. It was only when I was in college that I started thinking, that's a funny, trigger to have you end up in a psychiatric hospital for, now another 8 years or 9 years or something like that. And I thought, so I was kind of putting the pieces together of my life and trying to figure out who I was. And I mean, the miracle of that time is that I heard about meditation in that Asian philosophy class. And I didn't think, that sounds interesting. Maybe when I'm all grown up, I'll try it. Or, maybe, or I could never do it. That's for other people, which would be more likely. Or, that'd be interesting thing to maybe pursue in graduate school. Or, it was so other than that. It was so I've got to learn how to do this. I think this could really help me. And, and I was going to school in Buffalo. I looked around Buffalo. This is 1970. I just didn't see it anywhere. It was not to be found. And, or at least by me. And so I created an independent study project. The American Studies Department had an independent study program. So that settled on what my major was going to be. And I presented the project and I said, I'd like to go to India and study meditation. And they said, okay.
Now, did you have to sell cookies or raise money to go to India or get somebody's permission, or what was the backstory of that?
Well, it was my junior year of college, so I went with my student loans and scholarships. And so that, that was not a problem. And,
Okay.
uh, and also in those days, I think none of us flew. We all flew to Europe and went overland some one way or another, like train and bus. And
Was there anyone in your life who's, I know your parents were not in the scene. Maybe you're still in touch with your grandparents. Would you have talked to someone about that, and maybe they push back? Oh, I don't know. India is a really strange, and you had to kind of overcome that, or were you just kind of out there on your own, just like, I'm doing whatever I want to do, and it doesn't matter what anybody thinks about it?
I more told them. I mean, they were very worried. Of course, this was,
Right.
this is also a long time
That's
ago.
a far time. Yeah, that's a far away place, a long time ago. I mean, that must have been like, I'm going to Mars.
Yeah, well, there were no cell phones. There was no internet. There were not any faxes. It's like if you wanted to make an international call from India, first you had to go to a big city, which had the facility for that. Usually check into some international hotel, book a trunk call for 24 hours hence, go to some place in a booth and scream,
Right. So that
like
was
to
a
be
big
heard.
deal. That was a
Yeah,
big deal going to
it was a
India.
very big deal. It was a very big deal. And
How
even,
much?
like people often say, because it's unbelievable, to generations, younger than mine, that we had no internet,
Right.
so it'd be like, how did you find out where the reportedly great new teacher was, or where that retreat was going to be? Like, it was like, well, people told you, like everything was dependent on that kind of communication.
Or eavesdropping in restaurants.
Exactly, that happened too, as you know.
Okay, so before your trip, you meet this sort of Obi-Wan Kenobi figure, um, Trungpa Rinpoche in Buffalo.
I did.
Talk about that experience.
Well, I was going to the university. There were also other colleges in Buffalo, and Trungpa Rinpoche was a Tibetan teacher, Tibetan Lama, and somehow on his first trip to North America, he got sent to Buffalo uh, to speak at one of these other colleges. So this is about 4 days before I was getting ready to leave for India. And this is a small group of friends and I were going together. Some people, doing things on education and, like people from Buffalo. Um, and I I was 18 at this point. I was very naive. I'd never even been to California before, and I was about to go to India, and I had an idea that practices held within the Buddhist tradition, this is all from that Asian philosophy class that I took, would be like very kind of simple and direct. And
Mm-hmm.
you also, as they often talk about, you don't need to like become a Buddhist or join anything or reject anything else. It's really about methods. So that's what I was really aiming toward, but I had no idea where to go. Like, I don't know anything about India, where to find a teacher or anything. And so there was Trungpa Rinpoche, like a living embodiment, of a Buddhist meditation teacher. So they asked for written questions at his talk, and I wrote out the question. Like, my friends and I are about to leave for India in like 3 or 4 days to study Buddhist meditation. Do you have any idea where we should go? And he had this big pile of questions in front of him, and he pulled out my question and read it out loud. Do you have any idea where we should go? Any recommendations? And he was silent for a moment, and then he said, I think you had perhaps best follow the pretense of accident. And that was it. Like, no addresses, no handy monastery guidebook. I think you had perhaps best follow the pretense of accident. And that's exactly the way it worked out. I went to India. We started in Dharamsala because I'd heard the Dalai Lama lived there. I'd heard he was a Buddhist. And there were meditation classes and there were wonderful teachers. And it was the kind of situation where, it's like when something just doesn't work. It's like, it just didn't work. I'd go to the meditation class and be told, oh, the translator's like gone for a few weeks, so I'd go back in 2 weeks and say, oh, the teacher had to go to the dentist who's in Calcutta, the other end of India, and come back in 3 weeks. So then, it just wasn't working. And I did overhear a conversation at a restaurant saying that there was going to be an international Hatha yoga conference in New Delhi. And I thought, oh, that's it. I'll go there. And that's where I'll find a teacher. And I went there and it was like a nearly completely dismal experience where the low point was when these yogis and swamis were pushing and shoving against each other to be the first to grab the microphone and speak. And I thought, oh, great, this is hopeless. But also at that conference, a young man named Dan Goleman, who, we tend to know these days as the author of Emotional Intelligence, all these years later.
Mm-hmm.
But Dan was giving a talk at that conference. He was at the time a graduate student in psychology. He was studying meditation. And somehow he ended up giving a talk at this conference. And he mentioned at the end of the talk that he was on his way to this town called Bodh Gaya in India, where there was going to be an intensive 10-day immersion course into meditation. And it was very practical, and you didn't have to join anything. You didn't have to, reject anything else, exactly what I've been looking for. And I thought, oh, that's it. That's what I need. And it was it. I and actually many others followed after Dan to Bodh Gaya and joined in this course. And that began January 7th, 1971.
What was your feeling of India being completely opposite of Buffalo, New York? I mean, because like you said, this is before a lot of conveniences, and you're traveling around in cars, 17 hours, you're on trains. It's like you got Delhi belly stuff happening, and you got to watch out what you're eating, and it's like all these people and animals, and just all this commotion is happening. Did you feel like you were home when you were in India, or were you kind of tolerating it to get the knowledge that you came for?
I felt like I was home, and I was also terrified. I mean, that was true too. But I felt like I was home. It took a while to get there because, like I said, we took a plane to England and then the Oriental Express train, which was not overnight, the Oriental Express train, which was like days and days to get to Turkey, and then, ferries and boats and buses and trains and, all the way through the Mideast to get to Pakistan and then India. And somehow, as soon as I got to India, I just felt at home. And there was something also about the openness of it after all the kind of concealment of my earlier life. It's like this is street life. Like if you, I remember bringing in some of our Indian teachers from India to visit here in the States, and it would get to be in a lot of places, 8 o'clock at night or 9 o'clock at night, and the teacher would say, "Where's everybody?" Like the streets are empty. That's so unnatural, and there was so much openness, and yeah, I felt quite at home there.
Okay, so you're at this 10-day retreat. You meet. This is in Bodh Gaya, correct? And you meet Ram Dass as well.
Yeah.
For the first time. What was your impression of him?
Well, the teacher of the retreat was S.N. Goenka, and he had just left Burma pretty recently before then to visit his mother, who'd been ill in Bombay, and she got better, and he began teaching. And so he was very new to teaching in outside of Burma. And because Dan Goleman had uh, inspired quite a number of people from that conference to go. This was a group of people, it was a real gathering. And at that retreat, Ram Dass was a student there. He was attending as a student. He, of course, had been to India himself before. He was Ram Dass, not Richard Alpert. At that point, he'd come back to India after, I think, a couple of years in America. And there was a group of people sort of with him. They'd heard him on the radio. They, encountered him somehow in the States. And they were kind of with him, really trying to meet his teacher, his guru. But, this was, both old style. He was an old style guru. You didn't exactly know where he was going to be next. And he'd appear and disappear and be somewhere else, so they didn't know where he was, where the teacher was. And there was no, you couldn't text everybody or email everybody saying, hey, he was spotted, So they were trying to do worthy things with their time, and so there's a whole group of them who were attending this course with Ram Dass. So it was Ram Dass, Krishna Das, lots of people who are still good friends. And, I look back, Ram Dass, he was like the patriarch. He'd already been fired from Harvard. He'd already had a guru and a new name. And looking back, I realized, oh, he was like 38 or 39 years old. He seemed so old, He was really the patriarch. And it was when we were there together practicing that the first appearance of Be Here Now, his great book, was not a book, it was a box. And everything was like loose, the chai recipes and the things like that. So I remember him getting the box, and we all opened the box, and we were looking and oohing and ahhing and looking at all this stuff, and everything felt very fresh. It was really very new and exciting. It was such a sense of community and such a sense of discovery. It's like, oh, look what my breath feels like when I do this, or every little thing was so meaningful.
Were you so you were still relatively young at that time? You're like 19, 20 years old. Were you
18?
Would you have been, if I were to speak with Dan or somebody who was around at that time, Krishna Das, and say, what were your reflections of Sharon at the time? What would they have said?
She's very quiet. She's very sweet. Krishna Das and I, teach together a fair amount, and we often tell the same story, each from our own perspective, because Goenka taught many retreats in a row. And there'd be little gaps in between, and then there'd be another retreat. And at one of the gaps, Dan had gone to Allahabad, which is where it's the grounds of this huge gathering, the Kumbh Mela, which has these astrological points of like every 4 years is this and every 12 years is this. And when it's the big one, it's millions and millions and millions of people who come together to bathe in the Ganges. And
the largest gathering of humans on earth, they say.
Yeah. So Dan had gone there, and then he came back to Bodh Gaya, and we were practicing, and then the Mela was over. But this group of people around Ram Dass, some people who had really were at those courses because of Ram Dass, some people who met Ram Dass there, decided that they were going to get in this bus.
Oh my God, you were there?
I was there, sure.
On the bus?
No. I waved goodbye to the bus.
Okay.
That's why Krishna Das and I tell the story, same story from two different angles. Like,
okay,
they decided they were going to get in this bus and tour around looking for Maharaji, and they had no idea where he was. And there was no, again, it wasn't like a blog someone was going to write, spotted in, Benares as Guru Neem Karoli Baba. And so I remember deliberating internally, do I want to get on that bus? And I thought, no, I just discovered this practice. It's really important for me. They don't even know where the guy is, like, and I'm just going to keep meditating here. So when they left, Ramdas was the only one with a name like Ramdas. They were like Linda and Jeffrey and they somewhere, as they tell the story, because now I'm not privy to it. They're on the bus, and Dan Goldman wants to have the bus detour and see the grounds where the Kumbh Mela had been. It wasn't even there anymore, and Ramdas said no. He wanted to go right on to Delhi, and they had this discussion, and finally Ramdas said, okay, let's just, we'll go look at the grounds of the Mela. And so they got there, and there was Maharaji waiting for them by the side of the road. And apparently he had woken up that morning and told his hosts, make lunch for, I don't know, let's say 28 people. And there were exactly 28 people, including the bus driver. So at one point I said to Krishnadas, well, how long did it take you to find him? And he said, 10 hours. So his life choices is very interesting right there.
That's one of my favorite Ram Dass stories. The bus ride to get ice cream or go to the Kumbh Mela.
Yeah, that's why he wanted to go to Delhi. It was to get ice cream.
So you had your first experience. I think it was the last day of the 10-day retreat where Goenka, S.N. Goenka talked about Metta.
Yeah.
And talk about that, how that made you feel. And
yeah, well, the main engine for that retreat and for many, many approaches to meditation is mindfulness, which is really a way of trying to get closer to your experience, having your awareness be less cluttered, less filled with like old fears or future projections, so you can see much more accurately what your experience really is. It's like maybe it's pain, but it's not pain plus, the anticipation of the next 50 years not feeling any better.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really the essential tool in that 10-day retreat. But right at the end, almost as a ceremonial way of saying goodbye, Goenka introduced this other method, which is called Metta, Metta, 2 T's. And Metta means loving kindness. So it was one particular form, one way of doing it. There are many, many ways of doing it, but it was my first introduction. And so there, rather than trying to just get closer to the truth of your experience, whatever it is, you're actually actively offering kind of goodwill and well wishes to yourself and to others. And so Goenka did it a certain way through sensation in the body, because that was very much his approach with mindfulness, is being aware. But it's almost like fill your body with this sense of warmth and caring, and then you offer it ultimately to all of life, including yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was just riveted. I thought, wow, what's this? Like, I really want to learn this method. But I never, I studied it, and I tried to understand it. And of course, I was sitting with Goenka at times, and he was doing it in that same way right at the end of his mindfulness retreat. And it was only in 1985 that I went to Burma and did a 3-month intensive meditation retreat on loving kindness, on that particular technique. And they taught it somewhat differently than Goenka had done, but it's the same essence. And it became hugely important for me in my practice. And that was my intuition beforehand anyway. It's why, I really wanted to learn it. And So that was 85. I came back, I started teaching it right away as a method. And then my first book was called Loving Kindness, and that came out about 10 years later because I'm very slow.
So after Deepa Ma had ordained you a future teacher, and you kind of pushed back on that, this is we're in 1974 or something along those lines, right? And you still are kind of wandering around, linking up with Joseph in Colorado and staying in these houses with people and stuff like that. Can you just walk us through how you went from there to how you guys ended up starting the center in Barre?
Well, I went and saw Deepa Ma in Calcutta in 1974, came back to the States. I was on the East Coast. I was with my family. I did sort of the preparatory work for like getting a new visa to go back to India forever and all that. And in the meantime,
did they think you were weird when you were back with your family?
Yeah, I mean, everyone was so glad to see me, and they're so relieved, but I also didn't have either the sophistication or the language to really, explain. Like if they said to me as they did, "Are you still Jewish?" I would say, "Yeah, of course." Like I didn't know how to describe what I'd been doing, and but a group of us thought, oh well, this is another whole Ram Dass story, but Joseph Goldstein, who was also at my first retreat, that's where we met, had come back to the States about 6 months before I did. And he was traveling across the country with some friends, and he stopped in Boulder, Colorado. So Boulder was the site where Trungpa Rinpoche, same Trungpa Rinpoche, that had sent me off with the pretense of accident, no addresses, was establishing this institute called Naropa Institute. Now it's university because it's gotten affiliated, but in those days it was an institute, and it was the first place I'd heard of where there was like meditation and textual study of Hinduism and Buddhism and Tai Chi, martial arts, and so many things being offered. And so this is prior to the official opening, which was in the summer. And Joseph stopped there and asked in their office, he said, I've been living in India for 7 years. My teachers have told me to teach. I've started teaching in India. Would you like me to teach a course? And they said, no, thanks. So he went on to Berkeley. And as he tells the story, of course, we'd known Ram Dass from India, and, we're good friends. And so he said he got to Berkeley and he called Ram Dass, and the answering machine, which is what it was in those days, had a very forbidding message, like not talking to anybody, don't leave a message, So Joseph went off to Telegraph Avenue and to continue on the pretense of accident theme, he needed to use a bathroom. So he went into some cafe, and they said only for customers. And in a way, I still can't figure out, like he didn't buy like a bagel or something, he decided to go to another place to look for a bathroom. And I think he was on his third place when he walked in, and there was Ram Dass sitting in the cafe. So Ram Dass was about to go to Boulder to Naropa Institute, where he had like a mega class of like 1,000 people. And he asked Joseph if he would come lead the meditation subgroup. So we say he gave Joseph his first teaching job in the States, which is true. So Joseph went to Boulder and was very, very popular teaching that. So he was actually invited to stay on for the second summer session. But this is still the first summer session, and some friends and I decided, let's go to Boulder and visit Joseph. So we went to Boulder, and Joseph was living in a 1-bedroom apartment, like a student apartment that Europa had given him. And at one point, 9 of us moved in to his 1-bedroom apartment. And it was really onerous. Jack Cornfield was living down the hall. That's where we met. And I stayed on with Joseph for the second summer session. I was kind of his TA. And then we got invited to teach a month-long retreat, Joseph and I. So we did. And then we got a letter from somebody saying, you know, I can get together some friends and a cook. Would you come teach a retreat? So it was Jack, Joseph, and I, and a couple of other friends. And it would be different configurations of some of us. And we had nothing, you know, we had no home. We had nothing. I mean, they had, you know, both still living parents, you know, but on the East Coast. And but we were just like sleeping in people's living room couches, literally, and crashing at people's homes. And one day, one of the people who I think had hosted us the most said in some self-defense, like, I have a rental property down near Santa Cruz. Why don't you move in there? So we did. And we opened it as a retreat center where it was just a house, but you know, you could come and do your own retreat, and we would cook for you and just have a supportive environment. And somebody came through at one point, writing a book and wanting that kind of atmosphere. And he said, you know, you should really start a real retreat center. You should start a center of your own where it would be like a kind of sacred site in this country. It would be a place where kind of energy that's generated when people come together doesn't have to disperse. And he said, I know the people who can help you. They're all in Massachusetts. And he was right. They were the people. You know, formed a nonprofit, formed a board. We were able to kind of understand what we were looking for, found it, did the negotiation. We ended up buying this property in Barre, Massachusetts for $150,000, which we did not have. This is, you know, an institutional building or set of buildings that sleep about 100 and everything, you know, kitchen and whatever. It was $150,000. So we it was owned by the Catholic Church, by the Fathers of the Blessed Sacrament. So they gave us a $50,000 mortgage. We raised $50,000, and we couldn't get a bank to give us a mortgage for the other 50,000. So these friends went off to the bank and they personally took out loans so that we could open the doors. And so that's the Insight Meditation Society, Barre, Massachusetts.
So, okay, I had a couple of questions about this. You know, when you get a room of meditators together, usually they're not very business savvy people, especially people who've spent a lot of time in India, and you're following your heart and doing all these kind of what people would consider airy-fairy things, you know, especially if you work in the banking industry. Who was the driving force? Who was the organizer? Who was the task rabbit in that circle that made sure that things, the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed and things like that?
Well, it was, I mean, we were really lucky, that group of people that formed the first board, you know, the first board of directors. And they quickly saw, you know, we were not that capable in, you know, so many realms. And we had a policy for a long time, which we used to call the separation of church and state, you know, where the teachers would decide like who else to invite to teach and what would be taught there. And the board would decide everything a board is responsible for, you know, finances and so on. And so ultimately they had a lot of power because, you know, and clearly we knew nothing, you know, like somebody said in a very early meeting, you know, because we also grew up in a tradition in Asia, grew up in that sense, you know, where you did not really charge for the teachings,
Mm.
like in some of the places we paid room and boards, other places we paid nothing because even that was provided, and voluntary donations to the teachers happened, or to the monastery, and suddenly we're in the land of, well, the staff really needs health insurance. You can't, fairly have a staff here and not give them health. And it's like, huh, do I need health insurance too? I guess I do. It's a different world. And so when we open the doors, we charge $6.50 a night. And we had no money, like somebody's father gave them a car. That's why we had a car. Or, it was like those days. And so I remember a very early board meeting, one of the board members said, well, you're not thinking about depreciation. So I or somebody said, what's depreciation? And they said, well, like what if a roof starts leaking, and we said, oh, well, we'll just raise money for it, like not realizing we weren't in Asia anymore, So it was a real education, and I think necessary, but it was all dependent on those people. We could never have done it without them.
You guys just celebrated 45 years.
We did.
I was fortunate to attend that Zoom conference
Oh,
or
good.
call. What do you think is the secret to having a center like that stick around for such a long time?
I think having an empowered board is part of that. We don't have the same separation of church and state anymore. But I think that's very important because it's also, in a way, it's like the voice of the people, so there's like an exchange. And we've always, as you got from that call, somebody quoted me as saying we didn't know what we were doing, which was true. Jack quoted me as saying we did it all without adult supervision, which is also true. Um, we always were trying to find a balance between having a sense of tradition and recognition that we didn't just make this up, and at the same time looking at where we are, and what are the kinds of things people are facing. If you look at classical Buddhist teaching about livelihood, for example, interestingly enough, he does talk about livelihood, the way we work, or the way we actually, for many of us, spend most of our day, most of our life, therefore, is in work, and how that can, be very damaging because we feel, tremendous moral dilemmas, or, all kinds of things, or it can be unifying and bring all of our lives together. But you look at classical teaching and it'll say no hunting, no fishing, like no killing, no dealing in arms,
Mm-hmm.
But even there, the Buddhists sort of seem to have flexibility. If a monk was going off to teach in a fishing village, he'd say they have to fish, that's like their livelihood. So then they would talk about what to say. But, what does any of that mean now? Somebody tells me, as they have, I work for this company, and um, our policy, not my policy, the company's policy, uh, when somebody makes a request, is to immediately turn them down, because it's only the people who are kind of loud, the squeaky wheels, they get listened to. So the first thing you have to do is say no. And they were weeping when they were saying that, like, what does that mean in terms of the morality of our work right now in the things we face? And so as a community, we've always been in that tension, how to look back and honor and be aligned with, what seems really good and essential, and how to adapt and be open and be flexible and be free. And so from the get-go, it's been like that.
Well, uniquely, you also have personally experienced a few waves of this sort of popularization of meditation. And you were there when the TM stuff started. You were one of the proponents of Buddhist insight meditation. Now we're in this kind of this, I don't know if it's a third or fourth wave of it. What can history about meditation waves teach us about where this is all going?
I think for any person, any human being like myself or yourself, um, it's also kind of sensing where you fit in all of that,
Mm-hmm.
I have colleagues who are mainly devoted, or largely devoted, even though they're doing other things, they're devoted to helping train the next generation of teachers. And, these days, because of the popularization, there are many different kinds of training programs, and people take them and often do incredibly wonderful things with that credential, if it's a credential. But I've also heard, in the effort to really make meditation available to everybody, pressure to have a training program that may not be that thorough. Like, I was once talking to somebody, a friend, and she felt she had an entree into a particular organization or institution, and they were really going to have meditation be much more widespread within their organization, but they didn't want to keep bringing in outside people to teach. They wanted their own in-house people to be trained. And so she said, so now I'm thinking that I have to help create a train the trainers model. So I said, well, how long's the training? And she said 8 hours. And I said, you cannot do that. You just cannot do that. But that happens a lot too,
Mm-hmm.
alongside the, you know, really good training programs. And so IMS, the Insight Meditation Society, has its own training program, which is really a little specialized in that. We are an intensive retreat center. We're not in the city. We're way out in the country. People, when they were coming, come for overnight stays or for, retreats. And so it's a certain kind of training. It's like a 4-year training. And some people are just doing that. That's what they're devoted to.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, some people really want to teach beginners. It's a whole other thing. It's like, then you have to think about apps and technology and maybe being in a city, uh, if as we gather together again, physically, and or learning how to teach online. It's a whole other thing. And so I think people need to find their place of what feels inspiring and right for them.
Do you personally do things today that you would not have even considered doing before in order to stay relevant as one of the most influential teachers in the meditation space?
Well, I'm always doing things I never considered doing, like giving talks publicly or things like that. But I don't consciously have that thought. Like, I need to. I mean, people have told me that, like, oh, you need to watch
Like I
MTV or
need to get
something.
my Instagram. I need to make sure my
Oh yeah,
social
no,
media or
I have
tweet
all that.
more.
Yeah, yeah, no, I don't need to tweet my tweet. I mean, I live on Twitter. Uh,
You live on
I
Twitter.
live on Twitter. Uh, so yeah, I get all my news on Twitter now. I'm very Twitter oriented. Uh,
You're also a very prolific writer. A lot
yeah.
of people, they'll write a book, and writing a book can feel like like doing an Ironman competition. And I feel like a lot of people, they do it once or twice and then they're done. But you're like, what, a dozen books in at this point. Are you
11.
more are you more of a writer now that teaches meditation, or are you a meditation teacher that makes the time to keep organizing your thoughts in that way?
I think I'm more a writer now in a way,
Mm-hmm.
because I had always wanted to be a writer, and circumstances are just such. I am not traveling at all. I used to travel really a lot, and I was saying to somebody the other day, it's not only the travel time, but it was all the arranging time. Like, who's going to pick me up at the airport? And where should I stay? And what should I do? And is that hotel? That was a lot of time, and
Mm-hmm.
it's all recaptured now. And I am trying to teach online as much as I can in lots of different forms. And I personally find it very fulfilling. I know a lot of people feel uneasy with it. They want more, direct contact. They don't want to teach online unless they can see everyone's face, for example, on the screen or something like that. But I feel very connected to people anyway. And just reading those chats, there's, like, if we're on Zoom, there's so many people, they're just having such a hard time and are kind of exhausted. And it's usually very touching. Like, if I teach a retreat, or Joseph and I teach a retreat online, uh, people, and they're not all retreats. We teach programs, we teach classes, all kinds of things. But when it's a retreat, people are often writing in and saying, well, I could never come back right now to the center anyway. Like, I'm taking care of my mother who's aged, or I'm aged. I think those days are gone for me, or it's too hard, but this I can do. Thank you so much. And people always signing in from all over the world. And um, it's very, very gratifying. I mean, that program you did celebrating our 45th anniversary, there were people from like 47 countries signed into that. And so I really like the medium, and I certainly hope to continue, but it's also freed up a lot of time so I can write.
Mm. Yeah, your most recent book, Real Change, is a part of it. It seems like is it a trilogy, or you've kind of adopted this real theme
I know.
for your last few books?
It's totally unintentional. Like, real happiness was the first,
Mm-hmm.
and
Real love.
real happiness at work, real love, real change. Real change was a joke title. Like, that publisher said, "What should we call it? Real change?" Ha 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 ha. And so we were just banding about real change, like it was a joke. And then, of course, we couldn't think of another title. So,
Mm.
uh,
Well, you mentioned a few principles in that book, and I wanted to just talk about them a bit here, because I think it's really important for people to be exposed to some of these sort of perception shifts. You're really good with perception shifting and giving examples of that. One of them, I don't think it was in Real Change, it was in Faith, but you talked about Trungpa Rinpoche. He on this whiteboard he drew this kind of V shaped figure, and he asked you all, "What do you see?" And everybody said, "We see a bird." But what was he referring to?
he said it's a picture of the sky with a bird flying through it.
So powerful. Just about expanding your awareness of what you see. And then you said in Real Change, you said, we shouldn't look at childhood trauma as a gift. And you hear that a lot in the spiritual community. Trauma, this is your gift, your shadow side, just embrace it as a gift. You say that we should see it as a given.
Yes. That was a quotation actually from my friend Roshi John Halifax, and I liked it so much. I actually used it in my prior book as well, Real Love.
Mm-hmm.
And when I turned in Real Love, it was sort of a triumph because I was quite late turning in that book. And then I didn't hear anything from my publisher. I got like an away message, on vacation. And I thought, great, I could have had another 2 weeks if I'd known. But when I finally heard from him, his comment was, I really liked the book. My favorite part of the book was when you quote Roshi Joan Halifax saying, basically, don't force yourself to try to see the traumas of your past as a gift. They're givens. And I thought first, oh, his favorite part of my book, I didn't even write. Joan Halifax wrote it. And then I thought, I agree, actually. I think that that is very, very true, and therefore worth repeating when I did the next book. And because so many times we sort of try to force ourselves into a certain attitude, like, and in effect say, the fact that this hurts is my fault.
Mm.
You know, if I had a better attitude, if I had less resistance, if I could have a different perspective, it wouldn't hurt. And I don't think that's true. I think this is another part of real change. Some things just hurt. And it's not our fault. And what we really have both possibility and responsibility with is more what I would call the extra suffering. You know, something is very painful, but we add a sense of isolation to that, like I'm the only one. Or a sense of permanence. This is the only thing I'll ever feel. Or, you know, so many things we might add on just through conditioning or force of habit. And we can let go of those and be with what is painful in a whole new way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's so many gems. There's the riddle about the son whose father died in an accident. I don't even want to give that one away. I think people should just read the book for that one.
Yeah, thank you.
You talked about Thai sex trafficking, how that's really a result of conditions of the Thai farmers, and how violence is a public health problem. What did you mean by that?
Well, there are lots of ways of looking at violence. And, you know, there's a certain school of thought that says, let's look at it as a public health problem. It's like a crisis, you know, not a sin, so to speak. You know, there's something I also learned more about when I was writing Real Change, which is like attribution bias, where if somebody does something wrong, say commits a violent act, and we relate to them, it's like they look like us, it's one of the same tribe, we don't have a sense of othering them in some way, then we tend to look at causes and conditions, like guns are too readily available in that area, or education is so insufficient, or you know, there's so much trauma and kids aren't getting the kind of counseling that they need, or whatever. But if somebody is of the other tribe, so to speak, or we consider an other, then we tend to think of that act as reflective of a kind of inherent, innate defect. Like, that's a bad kid, you know, or people like that. You know, we don't look at causes and conditions and circumstances in the environment. And so what that perspective about violence as a public health problem is encouraging is just the former. Like, let's look at causes and conditions. You know, what is promoting this? It's not like some kid is innately bad, you know, or some person is not got a capacity. Maybe that capacity has never been nurtured, you know, never been listened to or honored. But and some people, you know, would equate that with laziness or being too lax, but it doesn't have to be. It can be really rigorous, you know, but it's also honest and it's realistic. Like, yeah, you know, let's look at what's happened here.
And you've also been really good about, I mean, you've been woke for a while, it sounds like, because you firsthand experienced, you know, incidents of racial discrimination against other people around you and things like that. So you've been very open about including that in your talks and in your books and in your writing. And I just want to acknowledge you for that. And just to wind this conversation down, I'm curious, where's the strangest place you've ever heard a Nat King Cole song?
Good Lord, I don't know. Probably an elevator, you know?
Do you see that as your mother sending you a message whenever you hear Nat King Cole now as an adult?
I kind of do in a way. I mean, there are a few.
Like, is that where your mind goes in immediately when you hear it? Like, oh, my mom, she's
Yeah,
sending me a
yeah.
wink.
Actually, I do.
I'm in
Uh,
this food court.
I don't know how popular he is anymore. He should be. His voice is beautiful.
What would she think about you and everything you've been doing in your life right now?
Uh, I don't know. Sometimes something will happen, like I'm in the New York Times or something like that, and people say to me, "Your mother would have been very proud of you," which
Mm-hmm.
is a very beautiful thing to say, and also sort of noting the absence of that. But when I was writing Faith, which is really like my faith story, so it's very autobiographical, there was a turning in there which was very important for me as a human being. And it just happened because I was in the writing process, which was I was writing about her death when I was 9 years old. And uh, there was just this moment when I realized she was like a 36-year-old woman, she was so young and she was leaving me, her only child. And I realized, oh, this is her story. It's actually not my story.
Mm.
And somehow realizing kind of the integrity of her being and what it must have been like for her, and uh, was an enormous transformation. It was very important. So uh, obviously it was my story as well, but let's not forget, like it was
Mm-hmm.
hers also.
You've said we don't meditate to get good at meditation. We meditate to get good at life. How does one know when they're getting good at life?
Well, that too can be a little confusing because sometimes other people see it in us before we see it in ourselves. Some
Mm-hmm.
people tell me I was going to stop meditating because I thought nothing was happening. And then my kids came to me and said, please don't stop. You're much better. So there are things like that, but we do see it in ourselves. Like, listen to how you speak to yourself when you've made a mistake. And are you kinder? Can you begin again a little more gracefully, instead of spending 18 days chastising yourself for having blown it in some way? Can you bounce back more quickly? How are you meeting a stranger?
Mm.
How are you if you're in conversation with somebody and you're not that interested and you start thinking about your email? Can you come back? Can you kind of gather your attention? How are you in adversity? What do you add? This is going to last forever. This is only me. Or can you see that and let go of that? It's real life stuff, and it's the important stuff,
Mm.
so it's good. That's where it counts. I just say that a lot because I've seen so many people discouraged through the years because they'll say, I sit 15 minutes a day or something like that, and I still get sleepy or I still have thoughts. And I say, that doesn't matter. It's really okay.
Mm. I also love that anecdote that you have on your website about U Pandita, who you were having those interviews with him and Barry. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we brought him. He's a Burmese meditation teacher. He was a Burmese meditation teacher, monk. We brought in 1984 to the retreat center where he taught a 3-month retreat, which I and many of my friends sat under his guidance. And so I don't know which particular story you're referring to because we were seeing him 6 days a week
The
for
one,
these.
yeah, it's the one about him saying, you were saying, you were going to tell him all about your meditation. He goes, well, what did you notice when you tied your shoes
Oh, yeah.
together?
Okay. Yeah. The reason I wasn't sure was because we were seeing him 6 days a week for these individual short meetings just to describe our practice. And he had a sort of teaching style where he would kind of get into a riff and he'd say the same thing every day, again and again and again and again, until something shifted inside of you, and then he'd go on to something else. So we were supposed to describe one sitting meditation and one walking meditation from the previous 24 hours when we went in to see him. So he just had some information, like I got really sleepy, or I was really restless, or I was filled with peace, or whatever. So most of us took notes. Like at the end of a sitting, we would just briefly write something down. At the end of a walking, we'd write something down. And we'd go in to see him the next morning with those notes, and as I did. And before I could read anything about my sitting or my walking, he'd say, "Tell me everything you noticed when you washed your face," which was nothing. So I'd leave and I'd sit and I'd walk as mindfully as I could. And then when I washed my face, I'd feel my hands in the water and I'd feel the water on my face. And I'd go in the next day. And before I could say anything, he'd say, "Tell me everything you noticed when you drank a cup of tea," which was nothing. So I left and I'd sit and I'd walk and I'd wash my face really mindfully, just in case he went back to that. And I drank a cup of tea. I felt the warmth of the teacup and I smelled the tea and I tasted the tea. And I'd go in the next day and he'd say, "Tell me everything you noticed when you took off your shoes," which was nothing. So I quickly saw where things were going and I thought, this is going to be horrible. And it actually was wonderful because everything became like a meditation and everything was important and everything was a place to begin again. You know, if I was drinking a cup of tea and got mad lost in some kind of fantasy and I realized it, I had to start again holding the cup right there.
I love that. Final question for you, Sharon. When you think about success these days, who or what comes to mind?
The first person that came to my mind was Ajahn Poo, who, as an advocate for domestic workers, including home healthcare workers.
Mm-hmm.
I think about somebody who cares, as she does, who was trying to help a group of people that were generally unseen, you know, or disparaged and treated unfairly. And that just watching the evolution of time, not that anyone is really treated fairly these days, but it's an actual movement. And given the pandemic, given the phrase essential workers, what was known inside families, but not really understood by society, you know, it's a growing understanding. Like I've been to many memorial services for, say, the parent of a friend of mine, and somebody will always say, "It was because of so and so, the home healthcare worker, that my mother was able to die at home," you know, or "so and so saved us as a family." And so, you know, if you've had the experience, you'd have individual appreciation and respect, but certainly not as a society. And so I just think of somebody like her, you know, who you could say labored in relative obscurity for a long time. And now it's a much more pronounced movement. And so
Beautiful. Well, I want to end this conversation by going back to something we talked about in the beginning, which is your love for caterpillars. And what
you're
that
sending me a caterpillar?
no, what that represents for me, you know, because a lot of times, you know, again, that's a very common, almost a cliche-ish sort of metaphor for transformation and change, you know, the caterpillar and the butterfly and the cat. And we put all this emphasis on the process and the butterfly, but the caterpillar kind of gets dismissed as this phase, this throwaway thing. You have to go through that in order to get to the big reward of being a butterfly. And the fact that you didn't really care about the butterfly part, you were really focused on the caterpillar part. For me, that represents a celebration of humanity, right? Which is what this is, because it's the humanity that we are getting an opportunity to express ourselves through as spiritual beings. And I think when you evolve to a point in your practice where you stop looking for samadhi, you stop looking for bliss, you stop looking for all of that, you realize, hey, the gold is actually in the caterpillarness of your life. It's in everything. It's in the washing of your face. It's in the taking off your shoes. It's in, taking the line out of that email. It's like those little moments where you find that space. And I feel like that's something that you uniquely contribute to this meditation space, just from your own lived experience and all of the trauma and the tragedy and the humility that you bring to the space through your various platforms and books. So I just want to acknowledge you for that. And hopefully, we'll get to enjoy many more books and, God knows what else, documentaries and movies and stuff based on your life. I mean, I'm sure it must be weird to see like Ram Dass's documentaries and things, having been with him in the early days. So, hey, I think that's going to be something that all of you guys, you and Goldstein and Cornfield, and, you're kind of like the Justice League of spiritual practitioners.
That's fabulous.
People like me who, I've only been doing this for 15, 20 years, which sounds like a long time to people who've never done anything, but, 50 years in the game, that's pretty significant. So anyway, I thank you, and I'm standing on your shoulders, and I appreciate all that you've done to bring this awareness to our society.
Well, thank you so much. It's such a delight to meet you and get to talk to you.
If you like that video, you're going to love the next one. Click this thumbnail right here, and I'll see you over there.